Every time my father told me I would amount to nothing, I deposited another portion of my paycheck into the account that would eventually buy the roof over his head. He never knew his greatest disappointment had become his secret landlord, until the day his eviction notice arrived with my signature at the bottom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the shadow of Richard Mercer was like living under a permanent storm cloud. My father wasn't just successful, he was the kind of successful that reshaped everything around him to reflect his own greatness. As the founder and CEO of Mercer Financial Solutions, he had transformed a small investment firm into a regional powerhouse through sheer force of will, uncompromising standards, and a ruthlessness that didn't stop at the threshold of our home. Our sprawling colonial in Westfield Heights wasn't just a house, it was a monument to what Richard Mercer expected from everyone associated with his name: excellence, perfection, results. 3 words that seemed permanently etched into the mahogany paneling of his study, where I'd been summoned countless times to explain why my achievements never quite measured up. "Nathan," he would say, swirling imported scotch in a crystal tumbler that cost more than my first car. "When I was your age, I was already managing client portfolios. What exactly do you have to show for yourself?" The truth was, I had plenty to show. Just nothing he would recognize as valuable. While my father built his empire on aggressive acquisition and high-risk investments, I had quietly developed a different kind of expertise. I understood property, not as trophies to be displayed, but as foundations to be built upon. Where he saw transactions, I saw transformations. But Richard Mercer didn't consider real estate management a proper career, especially not the kind I pursued. Glorified maintenance work, he called it, when I took my first job with Urban Revival Properties after college, instead of accepting the entry-level position he'd arranged at his firm. "You're choosing to be a superintendent over a financial analyst?" he had asked, incredulity and disappointment fighting for dominance in his voice. "This is what 4 years at Cornell amounts to?" What he couldn't or wouldn't see was that Urban Revival wasn't just managing buildings. We were revitalizing neighborhoods, creating affordable housing in communities that needed stability, and generating sustainable returns in the process. The work aligned with everything I valued: practical problem-solving, community impact, and long-term thinking. My supervisor, Eleanor Washington, had recognized my potential immediately. A former corporate lawyer who had walked away from a partnership track to pursue community development, she became the mentor my father never was. "Nathan, you have an instinct for this work," she told me after I'd successfully restructured the management of 3 underperforming properties in my first year. "You see the potential in places others have written off." Under Eleanor's guidance, I learned every aspect of the business, from maintenance logistics to tenant relations, from financing models to zoning regulations. I absorbed everything, working longer hours than I ever had studying for my father's approved business courses. The difference was, this didn't feel like work. It felt like purpose. By my 3rd year at Urban Revival, I had developed a reputation as someone who could turn around troubled properties. I lived modestly in a small apartment in one of our renovated buildings, saving most of my salary and bonuses. My father, of course, saw this as further evidence of my failure to launch. 28 years old and living in a converted warehouse, he remarked during one of our increasingly rare family dinners. "Is this really your ambition, Nathan? To be the best educated handyman in the city?" My mother, Catherine, would attempt to redirect these conversations, highlighting some accomplishment she'd gleaned from our private phone calls I made sure to have when I knew my father would be at the office. "Richard, Nathan just received another promotion. He's managing their entire East Side portfolio now," she offered, hope brightening her voice. My father barely looked up from his plate. "East Side of what? That's the wrong side of town to be making any real connections." These dismissals stung less than they once had. I had stopped measuring my worth by Richard Mercer's yardstick. I had my own metrics now: buildings stabilized, tenant satisfaction scores, community programs established, return on investment for our socially conscious investors. By these standards, I wasn't just succeeding, I was excelling. What my father also didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that I had begun investing personally. Eleanor had encouraged me to put my knowledge to work for myself, not just the company. "Nathan, you understand this market better than people who've been in it twice as long," she told me one evening as we reviewed quarterly reports. "You should be building your own portfolio." Starting small with a rundown duplex, I applied everything I'd learned at Urban Revival. I lived in one unit while renovating the other, then rented out both when I was done. The returns funded my next investment, then the next. I kept my growing portfolio separate from my work at Urban Revival, though Eleanor knew and supported my side ventures. Within 5 years, I owned 7 properties outright, with partial ownership in 3 larger apartment buildings through carefully chosen partnerships. I established Restoration Capital, LLC, as the holding company, intentionally, maintaining a low profile, not out of shame, but strategy. I had learned that some of the best opportunities came when people underestimated you, a lesson inadvertently taught by my father's constant dismissal. I might have continued indefinitely along this parallel track: corporate success at Urban Revival, private wealth building through Restoration Capital, if not for the listing that appeared one Tuesday morning in my regular market scan. 42 Oakmont Drive, my childhood home. At first, I thought it was an error. The Mercer estate wasn't just a house, it was my father's crown jewel, the physical manifestation of his success. He would never sell it. A quick call to my mother confirmed. Otherwise, "Your father hasn't told you?" she asked, her voice tight with the strain of navigating between us. "He's been having difficulties with the business. Some investments didn't perform as expected." "How bad is it?" I asked, already pulling up Mercer Financial's public records on my computer. "Bad enough that downsizing has become necessary," she replied carefully. "The house is too much for us now anyway. Too many rooms we don't use." The records told a more alarming story. Mercer Financial had over-leveraged on several high-risk ventures that had collapsed spectacularly. The firm wasn't just downsizing. It was in free fall. And my father, true to character, had apparently kept this from everyone, including his family, until the situation had become untenable. I sat back in my chair, staring at the listing for the house where I had grown up. The house where I had never been good enough. The house that represented everything my father valued, and everything I had supposedly failed to achieve. The asking price was ambitious, especially in the current market. My father was trying to project strength even in retreat. But I knew the property intimately, its true value, its maintenance issues, which the listing conveniently minimized, and exactly how much it meant to Richard Mercer to have it sold to someone worthy of his legacy. As I studied the virtual tour, an idea took shape. A terrible, perfect idea that would either heal the rift between us or sever it permanently. I called my bank and then my attorney. "I want to make an offer," I said, "but through a shell company. The seller can't know who's buying." For the first time in my life, I would use my father's playbook, not to follow in his footsteps, but to show him the path he had missed. I would become the owner of 42 Oakmont Drive, not out of revenge or resentment, but as a final attempt to bridge the chasm between us. If Richard Mercer couldn't respect me as a son, perhaps he would finally see me clearly as a businessman. And if not, well, at least I would own the roof over his head, assuming the leaseback arrangement I planned to offer as part of the deal. I had no idea then how completely this decision would transform both our lives. I only knew that after years of being the invisible son, I was about to become very visible indeed. The real estate market waits for no one, not even when you're Attempting to orchestrate the most significant transaction of your personal and professional life. Making an anonymous offer on my father's house required careful planning and perfect timing. I needed to move quickly before other buyers emerged, yet methodically enough to ensure the purchase remained untraceable to me. My attorney, Sophia Chen, raised an eyebrow when I explained my intentions during our urgent meeting the following morning. "You want to buy your father's house without him knowing it's you?" she clarified, her practiced professional neutrality slipping just enough to reveal her skepticism. "Are you sure this is about business and not something else?" I appreciated her candor. Sophia had handled the legal work for my previous real estate acquisitions, and she knew me as a calculated, emotion-free investor. "It's complicated," I admitted, "but the investment itself makes sense. The property is undervalued even at asking price. The neighborhood has appreciated consistently for 20 years, and the house itself has features you can't replicate at current building costs." She studied me for a moment longer before nodding. "All right. We'll need to establish a new LLC, separate from Restoration Capital. Nothing that could be traced. Back to you through public records." "I also want to offer a leaseback arrangement," I added. "Let them stay in the house and pay rent, at least initially." "Because you don't actually want to evict your parents," Sophia noted, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Because immediate tenant occupancy improves cash flow," I corrected, maintaining the fiction that this was purely business. But Sophia knew better, and so did I. Within 48 hours, Summit View Investments, LLC, was established, with ownership obscured through a complex structure of trustees and holding companies. My personal connection was buried beneath layers of legal paperwork that would require significant effort to unravel. Effort my father was unlikely to expend if the sale proceeded smoothly. I submitted an offer slightly below asking price, but with highly favorable terms. An expedited closing timeline, limited inspection contingencies, and the option for the current owners to lease back the property for up to 12 months. The kind of offer that a motivated seller would find difficult to refuse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then came the waiting. 48 tense hours while my father and his representatives considered the offer. I buried myself in work at Urban Revival, reviewing property management reports with unusual intensity as I waited for news. Eleanor noticed my distraction during our weekly leadership meeting. "Nathan, you've checked your phone 6 times in Dway." "The last 15 minutes, she observed after the other team members had filed out. "Either you're expecting life-changing news, or you've suddenly developed a social media addiction." I hesitated, then decided to trust the mentor who had never given me reason to doubt her judgment. I explained the situation, my father's financial troubles, the house for sale, and my anonymous offer. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I understand wanting to prove yourself to your father," she said carefully, "but I'm concerned about the secrecy. In my experience, transactions built on deception rarely end well, even when the intentions are good." "It's not deception," I countered. "It's a legitimate business transaction. The seller doesn't need to know the buyer's identity." "But this isn't just any seller. It's your father. And this isn't just any property. It's your childhood home." She leaned forward, her gaze direct and challenging. "What's the endgame here, Nathan? What happens when he discovers the truth?" I had asked myself the same question repeatedly over the past days, and still had no satisfying answer. Part of me imagined a dramatic revelation where my father would finally recognize my business acumen. Another part feared his inevitable rage at what he would perceive as a betrayal or usurpation. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know that continuing as we have been, him dismissing everything I do, me pretending it doesn't matter, isn't working. Something needs to change. Eleanor nodded slowly. Just be careful. The line between proving a point and burning. A bridge can be thinner than we realize. Her words stayed with me as I returned to my office, but any second thoughts were interrupted by the chime of my email. My offer had been accepted. Richard Mercer, the man who had built an empire through savvy financial decisions, had agreed to sell his greatest asset to an unknown entity. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same father who had repeatedly questioned my business judgment had just validated it in the most personal way possible, without even knowing he had done so. The closing process moved with surprising speed. My father, it seemed, was more financially desperate than I had realized, eagerly accepting the accelerated timeline and minimal contingencies. Within 3 weeks, Summit View Investments became the legal owner of 42 Oakmont Drive, and Richard and Catherine Mercer became its tenants, with a 12-month lease at a fair market rate. I signed the final documents in Sophia's office, experiencing a complex mix of emotions as my pen moved across the paper. Triumph, certainly. Vindication, undeniably. But also an unexpected melancholy. I had purchased my childhood home not as a welcomed son returning to the fold, but as a stranger hiding behind corporate entities. "Congratulations," Sophia said as she notarized the completed paperwork. "You're now your parents' landlord." The reality of that statement hit me with unexpected force. I wasn't just making a point or securing an investment. I was fundamentally altering the power dynamic with my father in a way that would eventually become impossible to ignore. "What happens at the end of the lease?" Sophia asked, voicing the question I had been avoiding. "I haven't decided," I answered honestly. "It depends on how the next few months unfold." What I didn't say was that I hoped these months would create an opportunity for reconciliation. That perhaps my father, humbled by financial setbacks and the loss of his prized possession, might be more receptive to seeing me, the real me, not his disappointment of a son. The first rent payment arrived exactly on schedule, transferred automatically from my parents' account to Summit View Investments. My father, predictably meticulous even in reduced circumstances, I monitored the transaction from my laptop while sitting in a coffee shop near one of my renovation projects, feeling strangely disconnected from the significance of the moment. 2 days later, I received an unexpected call from my mother. "Nathan, are you free for dinner this Sunday?" Her voice carried the forced cheerfulness she adopted when serving as intermediary between my father and me. "Is there a special occasion?" I asked, immediately suspicious. Our family dinners had dwindled to obligatory holiday gatherings years ago. "No occasion. Your father just thought it would be nice to catch up. It's been a while since we've all sat down together." My father, suggesting a family dinner for no reason. Something was definitely wrong. "I'll be there," I agreed, curiosity overcoming my usual reluctance. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself, sweetheart." Her relief was palpable. 6 o'clock? I spent the intervening days speculating about the purpose of this sudden familial outreach. Had my father discovered my connection to Summit View already? Was this dinner an ambush? Or was he genuinely attempting to reconnect in the wake of his financial troubles? Sunday evening arrived with uncomfortable clarity. As I pulled into the circular driveway of 42 Oakmont Drive, my driveway now technically, I noticed subtle signs of deferred maintenance. The pristine landscaping had developed rough edges. The exterior trim needed touching up. Small details. Most visitors would miss, but that the Richard Mercer I knew would never have tolerated. My mother greeted me at the door with a warm hug that lingered a beat longer than usual. "Thank you for coming," she whispered before leading me into the formal dining room where my father waited. Richard Mercer stood as I entered, offering a firm handshake instead of the cursory nod I had grown accustomed to receiving. He looked older than he had at our last meeting several months earlier. The confident posture remained, but new lines framed his eyes, and his trademark tailored suit hung slightly loose on his frame. "Nathan," he said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone I remembered from childhood lectures. "Good of you to join us." Dinner began with strained small talk, neutral questions about my health, comments on recent weather, observations about changes in the city's downtown development. My mother maintained the conversation with practiced ease, while my father and I contributed just enough to prevent uncomfortable silences. It wasn't until my mother served coffee with dessert that my father finally revealed the purpose of the gathering. "I imagine you've heard about some changes at Mercer Financial," he began, setting down his cup with deliberate precision. I nodded, maintaining a neutral expression. "I understand there have been some challenges." "Challenges," he repeated, a hint of his old sharpness returning. "That's a diplomatic way to put it. The truth is, we're undergoing significant restructuring." Translation: the firm was in serious trouble. My father would never admit to failure, but significant restructuring was as close as he would come. "I'm sorry to hear that," I offered, genuinely meaning it despite our complicated relationship. My father's identity was inextricably linked with his company's success. "These things happen in business," he continued with forced casualness. "The market shifts. Calculated risks sometimes don't pay off as projected." My mother placed her hand over his in a gesture of support. He acknowledged it with the briefest glance before continuing. "The reason I wanted to speak with you, Nathan, is that these changes have created certain opportunities within the firm." And there it was, the real purpose of this dinner, not reconciliation but recruitment. My father needed help, and despite years of dismissing my career choices, he was now extending an olive branch, not out, of respect for my path, but out of necessity for his own. "I'm offering you a position at Mercer Financial," he stated, as though bestowing a great honor. "Assistant Director of Asset Management. It's a significant role with considerable responsibility." I sat back in my chair, processing this unexpected development. After years of being the family disappointment, I was suddenly deemed worthy of a senior position, but only because my father's options had narrowed considerably. "Why now?" I asked simply. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Because you've demonstrated persistence in your chosen field. Those skills could be valuable as we navigate this transition period." Not recognition, not respect, utility. I was being offered a role not because he valued my expertise, but because he needed whatever resources he could marshal. I glanced at my mother, who watched our exchange with barely concealed anxiety. She wanted peace between us, had always wanted it, and would grasp at any opportunity that might bridge the chasm that had developed over the years. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully. "It's unexpected." "Take some time to consider it," my father replied, interpreting my response as hesitation rather than rejection. "The compensation would be substantially better than what you're currently earning, and it would put you on a proper career trajectory." A proper career. Even now, he couldn't help but diminish my achievements. I wondered briefly how he would react if I revealed that I now owned the very house we were sitting in, that my improper career had positioned me to purchase his most prized possession when his proper career had forced him to sell it. But I held my tongue. This wasn't the moment for revelations. This was a turning point disguised as a dinner invitation, and my response would determine much more than my employment status. "I'll think about it," I promised, knowing already what my answer would be, but wanting time to formulate it properly. As I drove away from 42 Oakmont Drive that evening, I realized I stood at a crossroads far more significant than I had anticipated when making my anonymous purchase. The house had been meant as a statement, perhaps even a reclaiming of power. Now it represented something more complex, leverage in a relationship that had never been equal, and an opportunity to redefine that relationship on entirely new terms. The question was no longer whether I would reveal myself as the owner, but when and how, and to what end. The job offer from my father lingered in my thoughts for days, a Trojan horse of opportunity disguised as reconciliation. I took the time to thoroughly evaluate Mercer Financial's position, gathering information from public filings, industry contacts, and careful conversations with former colleagues who had worked with my father. The picture that emerged was grimmer than he had admitted during our dinner. Mercer Financial hadn't simply experienced a few underperforming investments, it was hemorrhaging clients and capital at an alarming rate. My father had made a series of increasingly risky bets to maintain the firm's growth trajectory, leveraging its previously stellar reputation to attract investors to speculative ventures. When several of these collapsed simultaneously, the damage cascaded throughout the company's portfolio. What surprised me most wasn't the scale of the crisis, but how predictable it had been. The warning signs had been evident for years to anyone looking closely. Overconcentration in volatile sectors, insufficient risk management protocols, and an organizational culture that punished dissenting voices. The very qualities that had made Richard Mercer successful in his early career, boldness, conviction, unyielding confidence, had transformed into liabilities as the market evolved around him. I scheduled a meeting with Eleanor at Urban Revival to discuss both the job offer and my ongoing dilemma regarding the house. We met at a small park near our office building, walking along tree-lined paths as I explained the situation. "He's offering you a senior position to help clean up the mess he created," Eleanor summarized after I finished. "Without acknowledging that your approach to business might have prevented the mess in the first place." "Exactly," I confirmed. "And without knowing that I now own his house." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face me directly. "Nathan, you're at a critical juncture. The decisions you make now will define not just your relationship with your father, but your own identity, as a businessman and as a person." Her words carried the weight of someone who had faced similar crossroads. Eleanor had walked away from a prestigious law career to pursue work aligned with her values, making difficult choices that alienated former colleagues and even family members. "What would you do?" I asked, valuing her perspective more than, perhaps, anyone else's. She considered the question carefully before responding. "I think you need to look beyond the immediate dynamics of proving yourself to your father or helping him save his company. What outcome serves your long-term vision, both professionally and personally?" It was precisely the right question, one that shifted my focus from the tangled history with my father to my own aspirations and principles. "I've spent years building something meaningful at Urban Revival," I reflected. "We create value through sustainable development and community investment. The work matters beyond the bottom line." "And Mercer Financial?" Eleanor prompted. "Would be a step backward," I realized. "Even if I could help stabilize the company, its fundamental approach to business doesn't align with my values. I'd be abandoning everything I've worked for to prop up a model I don't believe in." Eleanor nodded, a small smile of approval crossing her face. "And the house?" That question was more complex. The purchase had begun as a point to prove, but had evolved into something more nuanced. "I think it's time to be transparent," I said slowly. "Not to gloat or assert power, but to clarify where we stand." "That seems wise," Eleanor agreed. "Secrets have a way of creating more damage the longer they're kept." With this clarity, I arranged to meet my father at his office the following morning to discuss his job offer. I deliberately chose his territory rather than neutral ground. I wanted to see him in the environment he had built, the place where his identity as Richard Mercer, financial genius, was most firmly established. Mercer Financial occupied the 22nd floor of a downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering commanding views of the city. I had visited occasionally during college when my father still hoped I might join the family business, but hadn't been back in years. The reception area remained impressive, all gleaming surfaces and subtle displays of success, but I noticed fewer staff members than I remembered, and a certain tension in those who remained. My father's assistant, a woman who had managed his professional life for as long as I could remember, greeted me with professional warmth. "Mr. Mercer is finishing a call. He'll be with you shortly." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "It's good to see you, Nathan. Your father has spoken of you often recently." This unexpected information gave me pause. My father discussing me? It contradicted everything I thought I knew about our relationship. Before I could inquire further, my father's office door opened. "Nathan," he called, gesturing me inside. "Thank you for coming." His office had changed little over the years. The same imposing desk, the same carefully curated art pieces selected more for their investment potential than aesthetic appeal, the same shelf of industry awards and recognition. But the man behind the desk seemed diminished somehow, as though the space had grown around him. "Have you considered my offer?" he asked, after I declined his perfunctory offer of coffee. "I have," I replied. "But before I give you my answer, I'd like to better understand the situation at Mercer Financial." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, the familiar expression I'd seen whenever someone questioned his judgment, but it quickly gave way to resignation. "What would you like to know?" "The truth," I said simply. "Not the version you present to clients or the board, the reality of where things stand." He studied me for a long moment, perhaps weighing how much to reveal. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "That's fair." He rose from his desk and moved to the window, gazing out at the city below. "The situation is serious. We've lost 40% of our managed assets in the past 18 months. Several major clients have withdrawn completely. Our credit rating has been downgraded twice. The candor was unprecedented. I had prepared for deflection, for minimization, for the usual Richard. Mercer spun that transformed setbacks into strategic repositioning. Instead, I was hearing genuine acknowledgement of crisis. "The board has given me 6 months to demonstrate a viable turnaround plan," he continued. "Otherwise, they'll likely pursue acquisition offers. Several competitors are already circling." He turned back to face me. "I built this company from nothing, Nathan. The thought of watching it be dismantled and absorbed by rivals—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the pain in his expression completed it more eloquently than words could have. "And my role in this turnaround?" I asked. "You have a different perspective," he admitted, returning to his desk. "Your experience in property management and community development, areas I admittedly dismissed, could be valuable as we restructure our real estate holdings. And frankly, your presence would reassure certain clients about succession planning and long-term stability." It was the closest thing to respect he had ever expressed for my career choices, yet it still framed my value in terms of utility to him and his company. I wondered if he was capable of seeing me as anything other than an extension of himself and his ambitions. "I appreciate your honesty about the company's position," I said, "and I'm genuinely sorry about the challenges you're facing. But I need to be equally honest with you. I won't be accepting the position." His face hardened, the momentary vulnerability replaced by more familiar disapproval. "May I ask why?" "The compensation package is substantial, Nathan. Far more than you're making in your current role." "It's not about the money," I explained. "Urban Revival is doing important work that aligns with my values. The skills I've developed there aren't just transferable to Mercer Financial. They represent a fundamentally different approach to business and investment." "An approach that clearly hasn't made you wealthy," he observed with a hint of his usual dismissiveness. This was the opening I needed. "Actually, that's not entirely accurate," I said carefully. "I've been pursuing my own investments alongside my work at Urban Revival. My portfolio has performed quite well." Skepticism creased his brow. "What kind of investments?" "Primarily real estate. Distressed properties with strong fundamentals in emerging neighborhoods. I paused, knowing the next statement would irrevocably change our conversation. In fact, my most recent acquisition might interest you particularly. Oh? He leaned back in his chair, more curious than concerned. I recently purchased a property through one of my investment vehicles. A colonial in Westfield Heights, 42 Oakmont Drive. The transformation in his expression was immediate, confusion giving way to disbelief, then comprehension, and finally a remarkable combination of anger and respect. You? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. Summit View Investments, is yours? I nodded, maintaining steady eye contact. I established it specifically for this transaction. I didn't want my name to influence the sale process. You're our landlord. It wasn't a question, but a statement as he processed this. Revelation. My own son. He stood abruptly, pacing behind his desk. How long have you been planning this? Was this some kind of revenge scheme? It wasn't planned at all, I answered truthfully. I saw the listing, recognized the opportunity, and made a business decision. The same kind you taught me to make. Identifying undervalued assets and moving decisively. He stopped pacing, studying me with new intensity. And now what? Do you intend to evict us when the lease expires? Is that your endgame? I have no intention of evicting you and Mom, I assured him. The leaseback arrangement can continue as long as you wish, or if you prefer to purchase the property back at market value, I'm open to that discussion as well. Purchase it back, he repeated bitterly. From my son. The property I bought before you were born. He shook his head, a harsh laugh escaping him. The irony is spectacular. This isn't about humiliating you, I said firmly. It's about establishing that I've built something substantial through methods you've consistently dismissed. I don't need to rescue Mercer Financial to prove my worth as a businessman or as your son. The words hung between us, reshaping the air in the room. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, we were speaking as equals, not in status or achievement necessarily, but in the fundamental dignity of our respective positions. My father returned to his seat, the initial shock giving way to a more measured assessment. How extensive is your real estate portfolio? He asked after a prolonged silence. 12 properties owned outright, partial ownership in 5 multi-unit developments, and 2 commercial properties, I answered. All cash flow positive, with an average annual return of 11%. He nodded slowly, calculation replacing emotion in his expression. Impressive, he acknowledged, the word clearly difficult for him to voice. And all this while working a regular job at Urban Revival? The work at Urban Revival isn't just a job, I corrected. It's where I honed the expertise that makes my personal investments successful. The company's approach to community-focused development informs everything I do. Something shifted in my father's demeanor. Not full understanding, perhaps, but a grudging recognition that my path, so different from what he had envisioned for me, had produced tangible results he could no longer dismiss. I still believe you're making a mistake by declining my offer, he said finally. But I can see you've given it proper consideration. He straightened some papers on his desk, a habitual gesture when concluding a discussion. Regarding the house, I assume you'll want to inspect the property as the new owner? That won't be necessary, I replied. I know the house well enough. Just continue the maintenance as you normally would and document any major issues that arise. He nodded, professional courtesy replacing familial tension. Will you tell your mother about this arrangement? I hesitated, having not fully considered this aspect. I think that should be your decision. The news might be better coming from you. Probably right, he agreed, surprising me with this small concession to my judgment. I'll speak with her tonight. As I stood to leave, my father remained seated, his expression unreadable. "Nathan," he said as I reached the door. "How did you know?" "Know what?" "That the house was undervalued. That I would accept less than it was worth." I turned back to face him fully. "Because I paid attention to what you taught me, even when you thought I wasn't listening. You always said the true value of an asset isn't in its current condition, but in its potential. I saw the potential you were leaving untapped." A complex emotion flickered across his face, pride warring with the realization that his own principles had been used to outmaneuver him. "Well played," he said finally, the words carrying a weight beyond their simple meaning. As I left Mercer Financial that morning, I felt neither triumph nor vindication, but something more nuanced, the quiet satisfaction of having finally been seen, if not fully understood, by the man whose approval I had stopped seeking years. The power dynamic between us had shifted irreversibly, not because I now owned his house, but because I had demonstrated the validity of my own path on terms even Richard Mercer could comprehend. The conversation marked a beginning rather than an end, the first exchange of many that would gradually reconstruct our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than patriarchal authority. That transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but the ground had been prepared for something new to grow. 3 days after revealing myself as the owner of my father's house, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. I was reviewing plans for a mixed-use development in a formerly industrial neighborhood when my assistant knocked on my door. "There's a Catherine Mercer here to see you," she announced, clearly unaware of the significance. "She doesn't have an appointment, but she insists it's important." My mother rarely made unscheduled appearances anywhere, let alone at my workplace. Her life had always been meticulously organized around my father's schedule and preferences. This spontaneous visit signaled something serious. "Send her in," I said, quickly clearing space on my desk and standing to greet her. She entered hesitantly, looking out of place among the practical furnishings of my office with her designer handbag and carefully styled hair. But beneath the polished exterior, I noticed signs of strain, shadows under her eyes inadequately, concealed by makeup, a slight tremor in her hands as she declined my offer of coffee. "I assume Dad told you about the house," I said after we'd exchanged awkward pleasantries. "Yes." She settled into the chair opposite my desk, smoothing her skirt with practiced precision. Though I had to press him for details, he was uncharacteristically reticent about the whole situation. I could imagine my father's reluctance to admit the full circumstances to his wife. Richard Mercer did not easily acknowledge being outmaneuvered, even, perhaps especially, by his own son. "I wanted to understand your thinking," my mother continued, her voice carefully neutral. "This seems like an unusual business decision." There was something in her phrasing that gave me pause. My mother had always been more perceptive than she led on, operating within the confines of her traditional marriage while maintaining her own quiet observations. "The property represents a sound investment," I explained, adopting the professional tone I would use with any client. "Prime location, excellent structural fundamentals, below market acquisition price." She nodded slowly, unconvinced. "And the fact that it's our family home? That it's where you grew up? That had no bearing on your decision?" I hesitated, weighing honesty against diplomatic evasion. This was my mother, who had always tried to bridge the gap between my father and me, often at her own emotional expense. "It wasn't the deciding factor," I admitted, "but I can't say it was irrelevant." She studied me with the kind of focused attention she rarely displayed publicly, habitually deferring to my father's more dominant presence. "Nathan, I'm not here to judge your actions. I just want to understand what you hope to achieve." Her directness surprised me. Throughout my childhood, she had been the mediator, the smoother of rough edges, never confronting issues head-on when they could be addressed obliquely. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure," I conceded. When I saw the listing, it felt like an opportunity I couldn't ignore. Not just financially, but I trailed off, searching for the right words. Symbolically? She finished for me. Yes. She sighed, glancing around my office, taking in the framed certificates, the project renderings on the walls, the visible evidence of a career my father had consistently undervalued. Your father is a proud man, she said after a moment. Too proud, often. He's built his identity around never failing, never showing weakness. This situation, selling the house, the company's troubles, and now discovering you're his landlord, it's devastating for him. I felt a flicker of guilt, quickly suppressed. I didn't create his financial problems, and I offered fair market value for the house. I'm not suggesting you did anything wrong, she clarified. I'm trying to help you understand what might come next. Richard doesn't accept defeat easily. He'll look for ways to reassert control. Her warning carried the weight of 35 years of marriage to a man who viewed life as a series of transactions to be won. She knew his playbook better than anyone. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked. Just be prepared, she advised. Your father admires strategic thinking, even when it works against him. But he also believes the game never truly ends until he decides it's over. As if confirming her prediction, my phone buzzed with an email notification. I glanced down to see a message from Mercer Financial's corporate counsel requesting an urgent meeting regarding the Oakmont property situation. My father wasn't wasting any time. I think I just got a preview of his next move, I said, showing her the message. My mother's expression combined resignation with a hint of admiration. Predictable. He's shifting to legal terrain where he feels confident. Does he have any grounds to challenge the sale? I wondered aloud, mentally reviewing the transaction details. Almost certainly not, she replied with surprising confidence. The sale was properly executed through licensed brokers and attorneys, but that won't stop him from looking for leverage. She gathered her purse, preparing to leave. Nathan, may I offer some advice? As someone who has navigated Richard's world for decades? Of course. Don't engage on his terms. He excels at confrontation and adversarial negotiations. That's where he spent his career. She stood, smoothing her clothing with the habitual gesture I remembered from childhood. Find another approach, one he wouldn't expect from you. Her insight was penetrating and practical. My mother had always been more strategic than she appeared, subtly influencing outcomes while maintaining a carefully cultivated image of supportive spouse. Thank you, I said, meaning it sincerely, for the warning and the advice. She nodded, then hesitated at the door. One more thing. Whatever happens with your father, I want you to know I've always been proud of the path you've chosen. Your work, creating homes and communities that lift people up, it matters. Perhaps more than the wealth your father has pursued. The words struck me with unexpected force. My mother had always been supportive, but in the quiet background, way that avoided direct contradiction of my father's judgments. This explicit affirmation of my choices represented a significant departure from her usual careful neutrality. That means a lot, I managed, emotion threatening to crack my professional composure. She offered a small smile before departing, leaving me to contemplate both her warning and her unprecedented endorsement of my career. I didn't have long to reflect. Within an hour, Sophia Chen called to inform me that Mercer Financial's attorneys had requested all documentation related to the house purchase, citing concerns about potential conflicts of interest and disclosure issues. They're fishing, Sophia assessed bluntly. The transaction was clean, but they'll look for any technical violation or procedural irregularity they can use as leverage. What's the worst-case scenario? I asked. Realistically, they might find grounds to delay the closing process if it weren't already completed, or they could potentially pursue damages if they could prove you had insider information that affected The sale price. She paused. But Nathan, we were meticulous with this transaction. Every disclosure was properly made. The offer was fair and transparently presented. Their posturing, not presenting a genuine legal threat. I appreciated her confidence but remained unsettled. My father had built his career on identifying and exploiting weaknesses others had missed. If there was a vulnerability in the transaction, he would find it. That evening, I received a second, more direct communication, a text message from my father himself. We need to discuss terms for moving forward. Dinner tomorrow, 7 p.m., Carlton Restaurant. Just us. The Carlton was my father's preferred venue for high-stakes business negotiations. Expensive enough to impress, private enough for sensitive discussions. His choice of location sent a clear message. This was a business matter, not a family. 1. I confirmed the appointment and spent the next day preparing as I would for any critical negotiation. I reviewed all documents related to the property purchase, consulted with Sophia about potential legal challenges, and even researched recent comparable sales in the neighborhood to reaffirm the fairness of my offer price. When I arrived at the EAE Carlton the following evening, my father was already seated at his usual corner table, a glass of scotch before him. He rose as I approached, offering a handshake rather than any warmer greeting. "Thank you for coming," he said, resuming his seat as the waiter appeared to take my drink order. We observed the rituals of fine dining with practiced precision, discussing the menu, ordering appropriate wines, exchanging minimal pleasantries about the restaurant's recent renovation. Only after our appetizers arrived did my father broach the actual purpose of our meeting. "My attorneys have reviewed the Oakmont property transaction," he began, his tone deliberately casual. "They've identified several areas of concern. Such as?" I maintained an equally measured tone. "Potential non-disclosure of material information, possible manipulation of the bidding process, questions about the legitimacy of Summit View as a properly registered investment entity." He took a careful sip of his wine. "Nothing definitively actionable, perhaps, but enough to justify extended legal examination." Translation: he didn't have a real case, but he could make things difficult and expensive if he chose to pursue it. "That sounds like a threat," I observed. "A reality assessment," he corrected. "Protracted legal challenges benefit neither of us. They're costly, time-consuming, and potentially damaging to both our reputations." "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, cutting through the preamble. He set down his glass, leaning forward slightly. "A clean resolution. You sell the property back to me at your purchase price. No profit, no loss. I'll cover all associated transaction costs. In exchange, I'll drop any potential legal inquiries." I had anticipated something along these lines, an attempt to undo what he perceived as a humiliating reversal of fortune. But the directness of his approach surprised me. No pretense of family reconciliation, just a business-like proposal to restore the status quo. "And if I decline?" I asked. "Then we proceed with a comprehensive legal review of the transaction," he replied evenly. "Which will inevitably become public, potentially affecting your standing with Urban Revival and your other investment partners." My mother's warning echoed in my mind. This was indeed my father's preferred terrain: direct confrontation, implicit threats, forcing his opponent to choose between capitulation and costly resistance. I could have responded in kind. Could have pointed out that any investigation would likely reveal more about Mercer Financial's troubles than any impropriety in my purchase. Could have countered his threat with one of my own, perhaps raising the possibility of increasing the rent or declining to renew the lease. But that would mean engaging on his terms, exactly as my mother had cautioned against. Instead, I considered what approach would be most unexpected coming from me. What would Richard Mercer least anticipate from his disappointing son? "I understand your position," I said finally. "And I appreciate your directness. But I think we're approaching this from the wrong angle entirely." He raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident. How so? We're treating this as a zero-sum game. You win, I lose, or vice versa. That's never been my approach to business, and frankly, it's not the approach that builds sustainable value. Spare me the community development philosophy, he said dismissively. This is about a specific property and a specific transaction. Actually, it's about much more than that, I countered. It's about two different visions for creating value and measuring success. And I think there's an opportunity here that we're both missing. Curiosity temporarily overcame his defensiveness. What opportunity? A partnership, I said simply. Not with Mercer Financial, but between you and me directly. A new venture that combines your experience with my approach to community-focused development. The suggestion clearly caught him off guard. He had prepared for confrontation or capitulation, not collaboration. What exactly are you proposing? I retain ownership of the house for now, and you continue living there under the current lease arrangement. But we establish a new investment fund focused on revitalizing neighborhoods similar to the East Side projects I've been working on at Urban Revival. You contribute your financial expertise and connections. I contribute my development experience and community relationships. He studied me with narrowed eyes, attempting to identify the trap or trick in my proposal. Why would this approach benefit either of us more than a clean break? Because it creates new value instead of simply redistributing existing assets, I explained. The kind of projects I specialize in generate returns that meet or exceed market rates while also building community wealth and stability. Your expertise in structuring financial instruments could help scale these models beyond what I could achieve independently. I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, not just financial projections, but assessment of motives and potential outcomes. My father never accepted a deal without thoroughly understanding its implications from every angle. You're serious about this, he said finally, less a question than a realization. Completely. I'm not interested in humiliating you or undoing your legacy. I'm interested in building something meaningful that incorporates the best of what we both bring to the table. A complex array of emotions crossed his face: suspicion, pride, reluctance, and something that might have been respect. I'd need to see detailed projections, historical performance data, risk assessments. Of course, I have comprehensive documentation on all my previous projects, including IRR calculations and social impact metrics. He nodded slowly, professional interest temporarily overriding personal dynamics. And ownership structure? Decision-making? Authority? Equal partnership, I said firmly. Different responsibilities based on our respective expertise, but equal authority on major decisions. Transparent governance from the outset. The remaining tension in his posture suggested he wasn't fully convinced, but his expression had shifted from confrontational to analytical. I had successfully moved the conversation from legal threats to business possibilities, terrain where we could potentially find common ground. I'll need time to consider this, he said finally, and to review your documentation. Take whatever time you need, I replied. This isn't a limited time offer. It's a genuine proposal for a potentially valuable long-term collaboration. As we finished our meal, the conversation turned to more technical aspects of real estate development and financial structuring. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, we were discussing business as colleagues rather than as father and son, each acknowledging the other's expertise in their respective domains. When we parted outside the restaurant, my father extended his hand with a firmness that communicated both caution and possibility. I'll be in touch next week after I've reviewed your materials. I look forward to it, I replied honestly. Driving home that night, I reflected on how differently the evening had unfolded from what I had anticipated. I had expected ultimatums and power plays, not the tentative beginning of a professional partnership. Whether my father would ultimately Embrace the proposal remained uncertain, but I had successfully changed the nature of our interaction. From adversaries fighting over the past to potential collaborators building something new. The house that had once symbolized my father's success and my inadequacy in his eyes might yet become the foundation for a relationship based on mutual respect rather than patriarchal authority. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, and the path forward would undoubtedly include setbacks and disagreements, but for the first time, I could envision a future where Richard Mercer and I related to each other as equals, each valued for our distinct contributions rather than measured against a single standard of success. That possibility, more than any property acquisition or financial victory, represented the true opportunity emerging from our conflict. A week passed with no word from my father. Then, too, I continued my work at Urban Revival, deliberately giving him space to consider my partnership proposal without pressure. Eleanor noticed my distraction during our weekly strategy meeting. "The situation with your father still unresolved?" she asked as we walked to the site of our newest project, a former warehouse being converted into affordable artist studios and low-income housing. "He's taking his time to respond," I explained. Which is actually a positive sign. If he'd rejected the idea outright, I would have heard immediately. Eleanor nodded, understanding the dynamics. Strategic patience is underrated. Most people rush important decisions out of anxiety rather than allowing the proper time for consideration. We toured the construction site, discussing material selections and timeline adjustments. I appreciated the concrete problems of building rehabilitation. The straightforward challenges of structural engineering and budget management were refreshingly simple compared to the complex emotional terrain I was navigating with my father. That evening, I received an unexpected call from my mother. "Your father would like to meet again," she said without preamble. "But not at the restaurant. He's asking if you could come to the house tomorrow evening." The location change was significant. The house represented both the tangible asset at the center of our conflict and the emotional backdrop of our complicated history. By meeting there, my father was acknowledging both dimensions of our situation. "What's his frame of mind?" I asked, trying to gauge what to expect. "Thoughtful," she replied after a moment's consideration. "He's been unusually quiet, spending hours in his study with your proposal documents. I haven't seen him this focused on something outside of Mercer Financial in years." The next evening, I parked in the driveway of 42 Oakmont Drive with a strange mixture of emotions. As both the homeowner and the son, I occupied dual roles that created an almost surreal dissonance. Should I knock on the door of my own property? Should I use the key I now legally possessed but had never used? I opted to knock, maintaining the social boundaries that seemed appropriate given the circumstances. My mother answered, greeting me with a warmer embrace than usual. "He's in the study," she said, her tone conveying more than her words. "He's been preparing for this conversation all day." The study had always been my father's inner sanctum, the place where he made his most significant decisions, and where my childhood transgressions had been judged and sentenced. Entering it now as an adult, as a property owner, as a potential business partner rather than a disappointing son, I was struck by how the space had simultaneously shrunk and retained its psychological power. My father stood as I entered, not behind his desk as I expected, but beside the fireplace where two chairs had been arranged facing each other. Another departure from the expected script. "Nathan," he greeted me, gesturing to the chairs. "Thank you for coming." We sat, and I waited for him to begin. He had called this meeting. It was his move to make. "I've spent considerable time reviewing your proposal and researching your previous projects," he said, his tone businesslike but lacking its usual edge. "There are aspects of your approach that I find intriguing." Coming from Richard Mercer, this qualified as effusive praise. I nodded, allowing him to continue without interruption. The Riverfront Commons project in particular demonstrated unusual financial architecture, he noted. The combination of tax credit syndication, private investment, and community ownership stakes created returns that substantially outperformed the market while limiting downside risk. I was surprised by his detailed knowledge of one of my most complex deals. It took nearly 18 months to structure that transaction, I acknowledged. The legal work alone was a significant percentage of the overall development cost. He nodded, professional appreciation visible beneath his usual reserve, creative use of the Opportunity Zone provisions, and the community benefit agreement protected the investment from the kind of local opposition that often delays or derails projects in transitional neighborhoods. We discussed several other developments I had overseen, my father demonstrating a thorough understanding of not just the financial mechanics, but the underlying community development principles. He had clearly done his homework, approaching my work with the same analytical rigor he applied to potential acquisitions for his own firm. After nearly an hour of substantive discussion, he leaned back in his chair, expression shifting from professional assessment to something more personal. "You've built something impressive, Nathan," he said finally. "Not in the way I would have done it, certainly, but the results are undeniable. From anyone else, this might have seemed like faint praise. From Richard Mercer, the man who had spent decades dismissing my career choices, it represented a seismic shift in perspective." "Thank you," I said simply, recognizing the significance of the moment without overplaying it. He rose, moving to his desk where several documents were arranged with characteristic precision. "I've drafted a preliminary structure for the partnership you proposed. It's not an acceptance. There are details we would need to negotiate, but it's a framework for discussion." I joined him at the desk, examining the documents with professional interest. True to form, my father had created a comprehensive outline covering everything from capital contribution requirements to decision-making protocols to profit distribution formulas. The level of detail reflected serious consideration rather than perfunctory response. "This is thorough," I observed, genuinely impressed by the quality of his analysis. "You've addressed several structural challenges I hadn't fully resolved in my initial concept." "Experience has its advantages," he remarked, the closest he would come to reminding me of his decades in the business. "The governance structure in particular needs refinement. Equal authority sounds reasonable in principle, but in practice, deadlocks can paralyze operations. I've suggested an alternative approach on page 4. We spent the next 2 hours in detailed discussion of the partnership structure, occasionally disagreeing, but always maintaining professional respect. My father's expertise in financial structuring complemented my on-the-ground development experience in ways that gradually revealed the genuine potential of our collaboration. As the evening progressed, I became increasingly aware of my mother, occasionally passing by the study door, visibly relieved at the civilized tone of our interaction. For perhaps the first time in her marriage, she was witnessing something she had long desired but never experienced: her husband and son engaged in mutually respectful dialogue. Around 11, my father finally gathered the documents, signaling an end to our discussion. "I think we've made good progress," he said, the formal phrasing disguising what seemed like genuine satisfaction. "There are still significant details to resolve, but the fundamental concept appears viable." I agreed, standing to leave. But as I prepared to depart, my father remained by his desk, an uncharacteristic hesitation in his posture. "There's another matter we should address," he said finally: "the house." I had wondered when this would resurface. Despite our productive discussion of the partnership, the property ownership issue remained unresolved. "What about it?" I asked carefully. He squared his shoulders, visibly uncomfortable but determined. "Your purchase of this house was unexpected. And initially I viewed it as a challenge to my authority, perhaps even a form of retaliation for past disagreements." I remained silent, allowing him space to continue this difficult acknowledgement. Having reviewed your broader investment portfolio, I now see it differently, he admitted. It was a sound business decision based on market opportunity, the kind of decision I would have made myself in similar circumstances. This was as close to vindication as Richard Mercer was capable of offering. Not an apology for underestimating me, but professional recognition of the validity of my actions. That said, he continued, this house represents more than financial value to your mother and me. It's where we built our lives, where we raised you. Its significance transcends its market price. For the first time in our conversation, genuine emotion showed through his carefully maintained professional facade. I had never heard my father acknowledge sentimental attachment to anything, let alone verbalize it so directly. I understand that, I said, meaning it sincerely. I didn't purchase the house to disrupt your lives or force you to leave. The lease arrangement can continue indefinitely. He shook his head slightly. A lease creates a relationship of dependency that would complicate our potential partnership. If we're to collaborate as equals, the property situation needs resolution. He was right, though I was surprised by his insight into the psychological dynamics. As long as I owned his home, our relationship would contain an inherent power imbalance, a reversal of our previous dynamic but equally unhealthy for a genuine partnership. What do you propose? I asked. Not a buyback, he said, anticipating my assumption. Rather, incorporation of the property into our new venture as part of my capital contribution. You would be compensated at fair market value for your equity, and the house would become an asset of the partnership. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, neither a surrender on his part nor a power play on mine, but a transformation of the property from symbol of conflict to foundation of collaboration. I would need to consult with my attorney about the tax implications, I said, considering the practical aspects. But conceptually, it makes sense. My father nodded, seeming relieved that I hadn't rejected the idea outright. There's one additional element, he added. Given Mercer Financial's current challenges, I would need time to arrange the capital for my contribution to the partnership. I'd like to propose a 6-month timeline for formalizing the arrangement. This was the closest he would come to acknowledging his financial constraints. Even now, with his company in crisis and his personal finances strained, Richard Mercer couldn't directly admit vulnerability. That seems reasonable, I agreed, recognizing both the practical necessity and the importance of allowing him to maintain dignity. We can use that time to refine the partnership structure and begin identifying potential projects. He extended his hand, reverting to the businesslike gesture that represented his comfort zone. Then we have an agreement in principle. As we shook hands, I was struck by the remarkable transformation of our relationship in the space of a few weeks. From the hierarchical father-son dynamic that had defined our interactions for decades, we had begun evolving toward something potentially more balanced, still complicated by history and personality, but with new possibilities for mutual respect. My mother appeared in the doorway, having evidently been listening to the conclusion of our conversation. It's late, she observed, poorly concealing her delight at our apparent reconciliation. Nathan, why don't you stay in the guest room tonight? It seems silly to drive home at this hour. The invitation carried symbolic weight beyond its practical suggestion. This was no longer just my childhood home that I now happened to own. It was potentially becoming the foundation for a new phase of our family relationship. Thank you, I accepted. That would be convenient. As I followed my mother to the guest room, the same space where I had stayed during college breaks and holiday visits, I reflected on the unexpected path that had led me here. What had begun as a property acquisition motivated partly by the desire to prove myself had evolved into something far more significant. The first steps toward a genuine reconciliation, based not on capitulation to my father's expectations, but on mutual recognition of our distinct but complementary strengths. The house that had once represented my father's success and my perceived failure had been transformed into a catalyst for reimagining our relationship. Its walls, which had witnessed decades of tension and misunderstanding, might yet contain a different future. One where Richard and Nathan Mercer built something meaningful together, not as father and disappointment, but as partners with shared purpose and distinct contributions. That possibility alone made the entire complicated journey worthwhile. The following morning, I awoke in my childhood home with a strange sense of disorientation. Sunlight filtered through the guest room blinds, the same blinds my mother had installed when I left for college, transforming my teenage bedroom into a more neutral space. This physical transformation mirrored the psychological shift occurring in our family dynamic. Familiar elements reconfigured into something new and not yet fully defined. Downstairs, I found my father already dressed for work, reviewing documents, at the kitchen table while my mother prepared breakfast. This scene of domestic normalcy felt both familiar and surreal, given the significant changes unfolding between us. "I've drafted a preliminary timeline for our partnership development," my father announced without preamble, sliding a meticulously organized folder across the table. "I'd appreciate your review and input before we proceed to formal documentation." No good morning, no acknowledgement of the unusual circumstances of my overnight stay. Richard Mercer, retreating to the comfortable territory of business discussions, rather than navigating the more complex emotional landscape of our evolving relationship. "I'll review it today," I promised, accepting both the folder and the unspoken boundaries. My mother placed a plate before me, my favorite breakfast from childhood, prepared exactly as I remembered it. "Will you be working from home today?" she asked, the question directed at my father, but clearly intended to create space for continued conversation between us. He hesitated, glancing at his watch. "I have meetings scheduled at the office, but—" He looked up, making a visible decision. "They can be rescheduled. Nathan and I should continue our discussion while the momentum is positive." This small adjustment, prioritizing our nascent partnership over his established routine, represented significant movement from a man who had structured his entire life around the primacy of Mercer Financial. After breakfast, we retreated to his study, spreading documents across his desk as we refined the partnership framework. My father's approach was methodical, addressing each component of the business structure with precise attention to detail. My contribution was more conceptual, focusing on our investment philosophy and project selection criteria. "These neighborhood vulnerability metrics," my father said, examining the evaluation system I had developed at Urban Revival. "They're surprisingly predictive of property value appreciation." "They were designed to identify communities at risk of displacement," I explained, "not as investment targeting tools. But yes, they've proven effective at identifying areas poised for market shifts." He nodded thoughtfully. "The correlation makes sense. You're identifying critical inflection points in neighborhood trajectories." He made a note in the margin of the document. "We should incorporate this framework into our acquisition protocols, but with additional guardrails to ensure our investments benefit existing residents rather than accelerating displacement." I stared at him, momentarily speechless. My father, the ruthless profit maximizer, was voluntarily suggesting constraints to prevent community harm, a concept he had previously dismissed as sentimental interference with market efficiency. "That's exactly right," I agreed, trying to mask my surprise. "We'd need to pair any property acquisition with community benefit agreements and possibly tenant protection provisions." "Draft a standard template," he directed, making another note. "We'll need to customize for specific projects, but a baseline framework would streamline implementation." We continued in this vein for hours, my father applying his financial expertise to strengthen my community development models while gradually incorporating elements of my values-based approach into his investment framework. The partnership taking shape wasn't merely a combination of our respective skills, but a genuine synthesis. something new that drew from both our perspectives while transcending our individual limitations. Around noon, my mother interrupted with lunch and the news that Eleanor Washington had called my cell phone twice. "I should check in with Urban Revival," I said, suddenly remembering that I hadn't notified my team about my unexpected overnight stay. "We have contractor meetings scheduled for the riverfront project this afternoon." My father nodded, gathering the documents we'd been reviewing. "We've made good progress. Take these with you and add your revisions. We can reconvene later in the week." As I prepared to leave, gathering my things from the guest room and thanking my mother for her hospitality, my father appeared in the foyer. He seemed uncharacteristically hesitant, adjusting his tie in a gesture I recognized as concealed nervousness. "Before you go," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "there's a matter we haven't addressed directly." I waited, unsure what aspect of our evolving arrangement remained unresolved. "Your continued role at Urban Revival," he clarified. "The partnership we're discussing would require significant time commitment. Have you considered how to balance these responsibilities?" The question was reasonable from a business perspective, but carried complex undertones. Was he genuinely concerned about practical logistics, or was this the beginning of a more familiar pattern? My father expecting my priorities to align with his even as our relationship evolved. "I have," I replied carefully. "Eleanor and I have been implementing a leadership expansion plan for the past year. Several project managers are ready for increased responsibility, which would allow me to reduce my direct operational involvement, while maintaining my strategic role." He nodded, processing this information with his usual calculation. "And Eleanor? How would she view your involvement in a separate venture?" "She's always encouraged me to expand my independent investments," I explained. "She understands the value of cross-pollination between different approaches to community development." My father absorbed this, then asked the question that revealed his deeper concern. Would she see our partnership as contradicting Urban Revival's mission? And there it was. Not just logistical concern, but awareness of the potential value, conflict between his profit-focused history and the community-centered organization that had shaped my professional identity. This recognition of competing ethical frameworks represented a level of self-awareness I had rarely glimpsed in Richard Mercer. "It would depend on the specific projects we undertake and how we structure community benefits," I answered honestly. "Eleanor isn't opposed to profit in principle. Urban Revival generates consistent returns for its investors. But she would expect genuine commitment to community impact, not just cosmetic social responsibility." He considered this, then made a decision. "Invite her to review our partnership framework once we've completed the initial draft. Her perspective could be valuable, and her support, or at least her understanding, would be advantageous for implementation." This willingness to subject his plans to external evaluation, particularly from someone representing a value system he had previously dismissed, was unprecedented. Richard Mercer had spent decades as the unquestioned authority in his domain, resistant to outside influence or criticism. "I think that's an excellent idea," I agreed, careful not to overemphasize the significance of this concession. "Eleanor has extensive experience with multi-stakeholder ventures. Her input could strengthen our model." As I drove from Oakmont Drive to the Urban Revival offices, I reflected on the remarkable evolution in my father's approach. The man who had once dismissed my career choice as naive do-goodism was now proposing a business structure that integrated community benefit considerations. The father who had repeatedly labeled me a failure was now acknowledging the value of my professional expertise. Eleanor was waiting in my office when I arrived, curiosity evident in her expression. "Overnight strategy session with your father?" she asked, her tone suggesting she found the situation both surprising and intriguing. I explained the developments of the past 24 hours, the productive discussion of the partnership framework, the proposed resolution of the house ownership, and most significantly, my father's request for her eventual review of our business model. Richard Mercer wants my opinion? Eleanor repeated, genuine astonishment breaking through her usual composure. The same Richard Mercer who once said community development was charity masquerading as business? The very same, I confirmed, though I think his perspective is evolving. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, processing this information. People can change, Nathan. I've seen it throughout my career. But transformation of core values is rare, especially later in life. What's driving this shift in your father's approach? I considered the question carefully. Multiple factors, I think. The financial difficulties at Mercer Financial have forced him to reconsider his business assumptions. The house purchase demonstrated that my approach generates tangible results. And perhaps... I hesitated, reluctant to overinterpret. Perhaps he's reaching an age where legacy concerns begin to outweigh short-term profit motives. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. All plausible drivers, but be careful about assuming too much change too quickly. Old patterns reassert themselves under stress, especially in family dynamics. I'm proceeding with optimistic caution, I assured her. The partnership has genuine business merit regardless of its impact on our personal relationship. Speaking of business merit, Eleanor transitioned, retrieving a folder from her bag. We need to discuss the Eastside Community Trust proposal. The City Council vote is scheduled for next week, and we need to finalize our presentation. We spent the remainder of the afternoon focused on Urban Revival's ongoing projects, the partnership with my father temporarily set aside as I re-engaged with my established responsibilities. The familiar challenges of community development work, navigating zoning regulations, balancing diverse stakeholder interests, securing appropriate financing, provided a grounding counterpoint to the uncertain terrain of family reconciliation. That evening, I returned to my apartment for the first time in nearly 48 hours. The modest space reflected my practical priorities, comfortable but not luxurious, with most of the wall space dedicated to maps and project renderings rather than personal mementos. I had always viewed this apartment as primarily functional, a place to sleep between workdays rather than a true home. Now, surveying its sparse furnishings and impersonal atmosphere, I wondered if this space reflected not just practical priorities, but emotional avoidance. Had I created a life deliberately devoid of attachment as a response to my complicated relationship with my father? Had I become so focused on proving my professional worth that I had neglected to build a personal life of depth and connection? These uncomfortable questions lingered as I reviewed the partnership documents my father had prepared. His proposed structure was impressively comprehensive, addressing everything from capital contribution requirements to decision-making protocols to dispute resolution mechanisms. The technical elements were impeccable, reflecting decades of experience in complex financial transactions. What surprised me most, however, were the sections addressing community impact assessment and benefit distribution. My father had integrated several concepts from Urban Revival's approach, creating accountability mechanisms for social outcomes alongside financial returns. The language wasn't perfectly aligned with how I would have framed these elements, but the fundamental commitment to measuring and valuing community benefits represented significant evolution in his thinking. I spent several hours adding comments and suggested revisions, being careful to acknowledge the strengths of his framework while offering substantive improvements where I had relevant expertise. As I worked, I realized we were creating something neither of us could have developed independently, a genuine synthesis of our different perspectives and skills. Around midnight, I sent the annotated documents to my father with a brief message proposing a follow-up meeting later in the week. His response came immediately, suggesting he had been waiting for my input despite the late hour. Review your comments tonight. Meeting Thursday 2 p.m. at Oakmont. Bring partnership naming options. The request for naming suggestions caught me off guard. In my experience, Richard Mercer rarely solicited input on symbolic matters, typically imposing his preferences unilaterally. This small invitation to shape the partnership's identity hinted at a more collaborative approach than I had dared hope for. I closed my laptop and moved to the window, gazing out at the city lights. Somewhere across town, my father was reviewing my suggestions, possibly incorporating my perspective into his thinking. The same father who had spent decades dismissing my choices was now engaging with my ideas as worthy of serious consideration. This shift didn't erase the history of criticism and rejection that had shaped our relationship. The partnership wouldn't magically heal decades of emotional distance. But it represented a beginning, an opportunity to build something new on the complicated foundation of our shared past. As I prepared for bed, I noticed a text message from my mother. "Your father spent the evening talking about your neighborhood, assessment models. I haven't seen him this intellectually engaged in years. Whatever happens with the business, thank you for this." The simple message carried profound meaning. My expertise, developed in a field my father had long derided, had rekindled something vital in him. Our emerging partnership wasn't just about business opportunity or family reconciliation. It represented intellectual engagement and renewed purpose for a man facing the potential collapse of his life's work. That realization shifted my perspective on our collaboration. Beyond financial returns or personal validation, the partnership offered something neither of us had fully acknowledged: the opportunity to complement each other's strengths, to address our respective blind spots, and perhaps to create something more meaningful than either of us could achieve alone. With this broader purpose in mind, I began jotting down potential partnership names, searching for language that would capture not just our business focus, but the underlying values convergence that made our collaboration uniquely promising. By the time I finally slept, I had settled on a frontrunner that I hoped would resonate with my father: Legacy Foundation Partners, a name that acknowledged both our family connection and our shared commitment to building something of lasting value. Thursday afternoon arrived with unexpected complications. A potential investor for Urban Revival's largest project to date requested an emergency meeting that couldn't be rescheduled, forcing me to text my father with an apology and a request to postpone our partnership discussion. His response was surprisingly accommodating. Business priorities understood, rescheduled for Saturday 10 a.m., better timing anyway, some developments to discuss. This flexibility, acknowledging the legitimacy of my existing commitments rather than expecting immediate availability, represented another subtle shift in our dynamic. The Richard Mercer I had grown up with would have viewed any rescheduling as a lack of proper prioritization, particularly when it involved his plans. When Saturday morning arrived, I drove to Oakmont with growing curiosity about the developments my father had mentioned. The house looked different somehow, not physically altered, but viewed through my evolving perspective. This property that had once symbolized my father's success and my perceived inadequacy was transforming into something else, a potential headquarters for a new venture that would combine our distinct strengths. My mother greeted me at the door, with unusual excitement. "He's in the garden," she said, gesturing toward the back of the house. "He's been out there for hours already." The garden was my mother's domain, a carefully cultivated space that my father had always appreciated, but rarely engaged with directly. Finding him there rather than in his study represented a significant departure from established patterns. I found him kneeling beside a newly turned bed of soil, dress shirt sleeves rolled up, expensive trousers marked with dirt. He looked up as I approached, acknowledging me with a nod before returning his attention to a cluster of young plants he was carefully spacing in the freshly prepared ground. "Japanese maples," he explained without being asked. "Your mother has wanted them for years. Finally found time to help her install them properly." I couldn't recall ever seeing my father engaged in physical labor unrelated to his fitness regimen. Richard Mercer hired people for manual tasks. He didn't soil his hands or clothes with garden work. "They look good," I offered, unsure how to respond to this unexpected tableau. Healthy specimens. He nodded, rising and brushing soil from his hands. Growth potential is the key with trees. Initial appearance matters less than root structure. And placement. He gestured toward the house. Let's continue inside. I have updates on our partnership framework. As we walked toward the house, I noticed other subtle changes to the property. Fresh mulch in the beds near the foundation, newly trimmed hedges, repainted trim around the windows. Maintenance tasks that would typically have been outsourced to professionals, but now showed signs of personal attention. In his study, my father had transformed the space from its usual formal arrangement to something resembling a project room. The large desk had been pushed aside to make room for a conference table, where documents and large format plans were carefully arranged. The walls, normally adorned with formal photographs and achievement certificates, now displayed maps of the city with colored markers indicating various neighborhoods. I've been researching potential target areas for our initial projects, he explained, moving to the largest map. Based on your vulnerability metrics and my analysis of capital flow patterns, I've identified 3 priority zones with optimal conditions for our model. The thoroughness of his analysis was impressive, especially from someone who had never expressed interest in neighborhood-level development planning. He had not only incorporated my evaluation framework, but extended it with additional financial metrics that strengthened the predictive model. This is remarkable work, I acknowledged, examining his annotations. The integration of capital availability indicators with community stability metrics creates a more comprehensive targeting system than I've been able to develop at Urban Revival. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face before he returned to business mode. I've also refined the partnership structure based on your feedback. He handed me a bound document significantly thicker than our previous draft. The revised model incorporates your suggestions regarding community benefit agreements and creates a more robust framework for measuring social return on investment. As I reviewed the document, I was struck by how thoroughly he had integrated my input, not merely acknowledging my suggestions, but building upon them in substantive ways. This wasn't the perfunctory consideration I had sometimes received in childhood, when my father would ask my opinion only to demonstrate why his approach was superior. This was genuine collaboration, with my expertise valued and incorporated. You've made significant improvements to the governance structure, I noted, examining the section on decision-making protocols. The balanced committee approach addresses my concerns about deadlock risks while maintaining equal authority. He nodded, clearly pleased with my assessment. It draws from a model I implemented at Mercer Financial during our early expansion phase, a hybrid approach that maintains clear authority lines while preventing unilateral control. We spent the next 2 hours in detailed discussion of the partnership framework, moving from technical structures to philosophical foundations, with a fluidity that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. My father's command of financial mechanisms complemented my understanding of community development principles, creating a model that honored both profit imperatives and social impact goals. As our discussion progressed, I became increasingly aware of something different in my father's demeanor, a vitality and intellectual engagement I hadn't witnessed in years. The defensive posture and dismissive certainty that had characterized his usual business discussions had been replaced by genuine curiosity and analytical focus. I saw Eleanor yesterday, he mentioned casually as we took a break for lunch, joining my mother in the kitchen. She had some thought-provoking feedback on our community benefit distribution model. I nearly choked on my water. You met with Eleanor? Without me? I was downtown for a meeting with Mercer Financial's board, he explained, seemingly unaware of how unprecedented this initiative was. Your office was nearby, so I stopped in to introduce myself properly. She was kind enough to spend half an hour discussing our preliminary framework. My mother caught my eye across the table, her expression conveying that she found this development as remarkable as I did. Richard Mercer, voluntarily seeking input from someone he had previously dismissed as an idealistic do-gooder, represented a seismic shift in his approach. "Eleanor is brilliant," I said carefully. "What did she think of our model?" She identified several areas for improvement, he acknowledged without defensiveness, particularly regarding community representation in the decision-making process. "I've incorporated her suggestions in the revised governance structure." He paused, then added with unexpected humility, "Her perspective on neighborhood investment dynamics is more sophisticated than I had anticipated. She offered insights I wouldn't have considered from my traditional financial background." This acknowledgement that someone from outside his usual circles possessed valuable expertise he lacked was perhaps the clearest evidence yet of my father's evolving mindset. The Richard Mercer I had grown up with acknowledged others' contributions, only when necessary, and rarely admitted knowledge gaps of his own. After lunch, we returned to the study to continue refining the partnership framework. As we worked, I found myself increasingly comfortable challenging my father's assumptions and offering alternative approaches. Interactions that would have resulted in tense standoffs in the past, but now generated productive dialogue. "I think there's a fundamental flaw in this investment staging model," I said at one point, indicating a section on capital deployment timeframes. "It follows conventional development phasing, but our target neighborhoods require a different approach. We need to establish community anchors earlier in the process to prevent displacement effects." Rather than bristling at this direct criticism, my father considered my point carefully. "Explain the mechanics of how that would work," he requested, genuinely seeking to understand. "The financial implications of accelerating community infrastructure investments." I outlined an alternative approach that prioritized stabilizing existing community assets before introducing market rate components. My father listened attentively, asking insightful questions that reflected real engagement with the concept rather than searching for weaknesses to exploit. "This increases front-end capital requirements," he noted, running calculations on his tablet, "but potentially reduces legal and political opposition costs later in the development cycle." He made extensive notes, then looked up with unexpected enthusiasm. "It's counter to conventional practice, but the numbers actually work better in our target neighborhoods. This is exactly the kind of innovation that could differentiate our partnership." His willingness to embrace an approach that contradicted established industry wisdom, to recognize value in methods he would have previously dismissed as financially naive, struck me as the most significant shift yet in our evolving relationship. As afternoon stretched into evening, we finally reached the last major item on our agenda, naming the partnership. I had prepared several options that I believed captured our shared vision, while honoring both our respective strengths. "I've been thinking about this as well," my father said before I could present my suggestions. "The name should reflect both our family connection and our distinct approach to community investment." He retrieved a folder from his desk and handed me a single sheet of paper with 3 options listed. The first was Mercer Legacy Partners, predictably centered on the family name. The second was Foundation Community Capital, more aligned with the social impact focus I prioritized. But it was the third option that caught me by surprise: Cornerstone Renewal Ventures. "This would be my preference," my father said, watching my reaction closely. Cornerstone represents the foundational nature of neighborhood investment, while renewal captures the transformation process without the negative connotations of gentrification or redevelopment. I stared at him, momentarily speechless. This name contained no reference to Mercer, no assertion of familial ownership or control. Instead, it centered on the work itself, the mission of community renewal through strategic investment. It was precisely the kind of name I would have chosen if given complete freedom, yet it had come from my father. "I think it's perfect," I said finally. "It captures exactly what we're trying to build." A look of genuine pleasure crossed his face, not the familiar satisfaction of having his preference accepted, but the deeper contentment of connection through shared vision. "Then Cornerstone Renewal Ventures it is," he declared, extending his hand to formalize our agreement. As we shook hands, no longer the distant professional gesture of our earlier negotiations, but a genuine symbol of partnership, I realized how profoundly our relationship had transformed in the space of a few weeks. From the hierarchical dynamic that had defined our interactions for decades, we had begun evolving toward genuine collaboration based on mutual respect and complementary strengths. This evolution hadn't erased our differences or healed all past wounds. My father remained more focused on financial mechanisms than community relationships. I still prioritized social impact metrics over pure return calculations. But these differences had transformed from sources of conflict to complementary perspectives that strengthened our shared enterprise. As we finished our work and joined my mother for dinner, I recognized that what we were building extended beyond business partnership. We were creating a new foundation for family connection, one based not on authority and compliance, but on mutual recognition of distinct but equally valuable contributions. The house that had once symbolized the distance between us, my father's, achievement that I could never match, was becoming the literal and figurative foundation for a new chapter in our relationship. Its walls, which had witnessed decades of tension and misunderstanding, now contained the blueprints for something neither of us could have built alone. "To Cornerstone," my mother offered, raising her glass at dinner. "May it be everything you both envision." As we toasted our new venture, I caught something in my father's expression I had rarely seen directed toward me. Not just approval or acceptance, but genuine pride. Not pride in a reflection of himself, but in the unique strengths I had developed along my own path. That moment of recognition, more than any business success we might achieve together, represented the true renewal of our relationship, a cornerstone upon which we could build something authentic and enduring. The transition from conceptual agreement to operational reality began with surprising momentum. Within 2 weeks of finalizing our partnership name, my father secured temporary office space in a renovated industrial building downtown, a deliberate departure from Mercer, Financial's imposing high-rise headquarters. The open concept loft with exposed brick walls and abundant natural light represented a physical manifestation of our new approach, transparent, accessible, and integrated with the urban fabric rather than towering above it. "What do you think?" my father asked as he led me through the space for the first time. The question itself reflected our evolving relationship. Richard Mercer genuinely seeking my opinion rather than presenting a fait accompli. "It's perfect," I replied, appreciating the symbolism as much as the practical layout. The central workspace promotes collaboration, while the conference areas provide privacy when needed. And the location is ideal, walking distance to 3 of our target neighborhoods. He nodded, pleased with my assessment. "I had them install additional data infrastructure to support your mapping systems. The building's recently upgraded fiber optic lines should provide the bandwidth you mentioned needing for community demographic visualization." This attention to my technical requirements, anticipating needs I had only briefly mentioned during our planning discussions, demonstrated how seriously he was taking my operational input. The Richard Mercer of the past would have prioritized impressive client-facing facilities over practical work tools. This balance of form and function represented another subtle but significant shift in his approach. As we explored the space, my father outlined his timeline for transferring select assets from Mercer Financial to provide our initial capital base. The process was more complex than I had anticipated, requiring careful navigation of fiduciary obligations to existing investors, while establishing our new entity's independence. "The board has approved the spin-off of our community development portfolio," he explained, showing me the transaction structure he had developed. "These assets align with Cornerstone's mission and represent approximately $20 million in deployable capital. Combined with the properties you're contributing, we'll have sufficient scale for institutional credibility while maintaining the agility of a boutique firm. The financial architecture was impressive, preserving value while creating new potential through strategic recombination. While I had developed expertise in project-level financing, my father's mastery of large-scale capital structures provided capabilities I couldn't have accessed independently. "What about your remaining responsibilities at Mercer Financial?" I asked, aware that he was still technically CEO of the struggling firm. A shadow crossed his face, the first indication of vulnerability I had seen since our partnership discussions began. "The transition plan is progressing. Wilson Bradford from the Chicago office is stepping in as interim CEO while the board evaluates long-term leadership options." The careful phrasing couldn't disguise the reality. My father was being sidelined from the company he had built. While our partnership offered a new direction, the loss of his primary professional identity represented a profound personal challenge. "How are you feeling about that shift?" I ventured, testing the boundaries of our newly established openness. He didn't answer immediately, moving to the window to gaze at the city skyline where Mercer Financial's headquarters dominated the view. 35 years, he said finally. "I built that company from nothing, made thousands of decisions that shaped its growth. Letting go is—" He trailed off, searching for words to express emotions he typically suppressed. "Complicated," I suggested. "Both an ending and a beginning." He nodded, appreciation flickering across his features at my understanding rather than judgment. "Precisely. There's loss, certainly. But also—" He hesitated, then admitted something I would never have expected from Richard Mercer. "Relief." The constant pressure to maintain growth trajectories, to project unwavering confidence regardless of market conditions, it became exhausting. This glimpse of my father's inner experience, the toll of sustaining the infallible persona he had constructed, created a new dimension of connection between us. For the first time, I could see beyond the imposing figure who had shaped my childhood to the complex human being navigating his own challenges and uncertainties. "Cornerstone offers something different," I observed. "Success metrics beyond quarterly earnings reports. Impact that extends beyond shareholder returns." "That's part of the appeal," he acknowledged. "Building something with lasting value rather than chasing market fluctuations." He turned from the window, composure restored. "But enough reflection. We have implementation targets to meet. The first neighborhood assessment team starts field research on Monday." The following weeks unfolded, with remarkable productivity as Cornerstone transitioned from concept to operation. My father approached the launch with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his work at Mercer Financial, but with a new openness to collaborative input that transformed the process. Each morning began with a strategy session where we coordinated our distinct responsibilities, my father handling capital structure and investor relations, while I managed community engagement and project design. The division leveraged our respective strengths while creating natural integration points for cross-functional learning. "The Riverside Community Council has concerns about our proposed timeline," I explained during one such meeting, reviewing feedback from local leaders in one of our target neighborhoods. "They've experienced broken promises from previous developers and want more concrete commitments before supporting rezoning applications." Rather than dismissing these concerns as obstacles to be overcome, his typical approach to community opposition in the past, my father considered them thoughtfully. "What specific assurances would address their hesitation?" "Three main priorities," I replied, impressed by his willingness to engage substantively with community perspectives. "First, a legally binding community benefits agreement with enforcement mechanisms. Second, a phased development approach that prioritizes affordable housing before market rate components. Third, local hiring requirements with skills training programs for neighborhood residents." My father made detailed notes, then looked up with unexpected determination. "Draft the community benefits agreement today. I'll review funding structures to accommodate the phased approach, and we'll develop a hiring framework that exceeds their expectations. I want to present a comprehensive response at Thursday's community meeting. This commitment to addressing neighborhood concerns proactively, rather than reluctantly, represented profound evolution in my father's development philosophy. The Richard Mercer, who had dismissed community input as inefficient obstruction, was now prioritizing relationship building as essential to project success. Similar transformations appeared in other aspects of our operation. When establishing Cornerstone's investment criteria, my father integrated social impact metrics alongside financial performance indicators, creating balanced scorecards that valued community stability and local wealth creation as core success measures. These sustainability factors need prominent placement in our investor presentations, he insisted while reviewing our marketing materials. We're not just promising competitive returns, we're delivering them through a fundamentally different approach to value creation. This wasn't mere window dressing or superficial social responsibility language. My father had immersed himself in the research on sustainable community development, educating himself about concepts he had previously dismissed. He approached this learning with the same rigor he had applied to financial analysis throughout his career. Eleanor noted this evolution when she visited our offices to discuss potential collaboration between Urban Revival and Cornerstone. Your father asked remarkably insightful questions about our tenant stability metrics, she commented. Afterward, he's genuinely engaging with the social dimensions of development, not just tolerating them as necessary concessions. He's approaching community investment with the same analytical depth he applied to financial markets, I observed. Once he recognized the value proposition, he committed fully to understanding the mechanics. It's more than intellectual engagement, Eleanor countered. I see genuine value alignment emerging. He's internalizing principles that previously seemed foreign to his worldview. This transformation became particularly evident during our first major project acquisition, a neglected commercial corridor in a historically underserved neighborhood. As we conducted site visits and community listening sessions, my father demonstrated unexpected patience with the complex relationship-intensive process of participatory planning. These residents have essential knowledge we can't access through data analysis alone, he acknowledged after a 3-hour community workshop that ran well beyond its scheduled conclusion. Their lived experience of the neighborhood reveals opportunities and constraints that wouldn't appear in market studies. This recognition that valuable insight could come from sources outside traditional expertise hierarchies represented perhaps the most profound shift in my father's approach. The man who had built his career on the primacy of financial acumen was now advocating for diverse knowledge inputs and collaborative decision-making. As Cornerstone's operational framework solidified, we encountered inevitable challenges that tested our partnership. Financial projections required adjustment as market conditions evolved. Community engagement processes revealed conflicting neighborhood priorities. Regulatory approvals faced unexpected delays. Each obstacle presented an opportunity to either revert to old patterns or reinforce our emerging collaborative model. One particularly difficult situation arose when a potential anchor tenant for our first development withdrew unexpectedly, creating a significant gap in our financial projections. In the past, such a setback would have triggered my father's most authoritarian tendencies, imposing unilateral decisions and dismissing alternative perspectives in the name of crisis management. Instead, he called an emergency team meeting where he presented the challenge with remarkable transparency. We've lost the Westside Health Center as our primary commercial tenant, he announced to our small but growing staff. This creates both a financial gap and a community service deficit in our development plan. I want to hear everyone's ideas for addressing both dimensions of this challenge. What followed was a genuine brainstorming session where team members from diverse backgrounds offered perspectives my father would have previously ignored. A junior community liaison suggested approaching a network of independent healthcare practitioners to create a cooperative clinic model. our sustainability coordinator identified potential grants for community health infrastructure that could offset development costs. My father listened attentively to each suggestion, asking clarifying questions without judgment and building connections between complementary ideas. These approaches have merit, he acknowledged after everyone had contributed. Nathan and I will integrate them into a revised strategy. Thank you for your thoughtful input. Later, reviewing potential solutions in private, my father reflected on the process with surprising self-awareness. 10 years ago, even 1 year ago, I would have dictated a solution and expected immediate implementation. No discussion, no alternative perspectives. What changed? I asked, genuinely curious about his internal evolution. He considered the question carefully. Experience, partly. I've seen the limitations of that approach, how it creates superficial compliance but inhibits innovation and commitment. He paused, then added with unusual candor, "And watching you lead differently at Urban Revival. Your collaborative style initially struck me as inefficient, but the results speak for themselves. Your teams demonstrate extraordinary dedication and creativity because they have genuine agency." This acknowledgement, that he had learned from my leadership approach rather than dismissing it, represented perhaps the most profound shift in our relationship. The hierarchy that had defined our interactions for decades had truly begun to flatten, creating space for mutual influence and reciprocal growth. As Cornerstone approached the groundbreaking for our first major project, my father surprised me with an unexpected proposal. "I think you should lead the public presentation at the ceremony." Really? I had assumed he would want to maintain the visible leadership role, particularly for milestone events that would draw media attention. "You've built the community relationships that made this project possible," he explained. "The residents trust your commitment to their priorities, and frankly, you articulate our vision more authentically than I can at this stage." This willingness to step back from the spotlight, to recognize that effective leadership sometimes means empowering others to represent the work, demonstrated genuine evolution in my father's understanding of his role. The man who had always insisted on central positioning was now prioritizing project success over personal recognition. As I prepared my remarks for the groundbreaking ceremony, reviewing our journey from concept to implementation, I reflected on the parallel transformation of our partnership and the neighborhood we were helping to revitalize. Both had required letting go of limiting past patterns, building on existing strengths, and creating new possibilities through thoughtful collaboration. The implementation phase of Cornerstone had revealed something I hadn't fully anticipated: my father's capacity for growth and adaptation in his 7th decade of life. The rigid, authoritarian businessman was evolving into a more nuanced leader who could integrate multiple value systems and empower diverse contributions. This transformation didn't erase our differences or heal all past wounds, but it created a foundation for something neither of us had experienced before: a genuinely reciprocal relationship where each of us could learn from and be changed by the other's unique strengths and perspectives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.